All right, very cool. Well, I'm excited to have my guest with me today, and welcome to all of you who are joining, who are listening to this recorded or joining us live. Glad to talk with you from the Post-Evangelical podcast, and I am Paul. Not really I don't know if I'm really a pastor anymore, but I play one on social media and do all that stuff. But excited to have the co-host of the This Is Not Church podcast. And they happen to be brothers, and John and Nat are with us today. How are you guys?
We're good, man. How are you, John?
Oh, I'm great. Just sitting here relaxing, having a beer for the evening.
You guys just recorded a podcast together before you came on here, right?
Yeah, we just interviewed Dan Henderson.
Yep.
I shouldn't say it like it's a question.
Yeah,
who was it again? He was the first guy in a long time. I forgot. I actually asked. I was doing the intro for him, and I'm like, "Hey, we're so glad to have on the show tonight." Ah, crap, John. What was this guy's name again? I just got finished telling John what a dad had, and I showed up 5 or so minutes late to the podcast, and I'm just frazzled. I'm like, I don't know what the guy's name is, but he wrote a book called Confessions of a Recovering Evangelical, and it's a good story. It's a guy who's in his 60s, I think, who came forward at a Billy Graham crusade when he was a kid, and that's his life. That's his story. As evangelical as they come, and has this sort of same reckoning that I think.
I am, right?
Yeah, and at the risk of sounding, I don't know, whatever you might call this, but I think he had the same kind of crisis of faith that so many of us have, that I think honest people eventually have. Yeah. I think the only way you avoid crises of faith is to willfully stay in the dark and just stop asking the questions.
Right.
I think most
people do.
Yeah, a lot of people do. I mean, and I write about that in places. I know John has written about that somewhat. But for some people, the risk of asking those questions is just too great. But I think eventually a lot of people get to a point where, consequences be damned. Like, I just can't take this cognitive dissonance anymore. Something has to give. And so,
you have to get there, right? I think we're born. We are inherently pack animals, and the threat of losing community shuts us up a lot, doesn't it?
It does. So for some people, it takes an awful lot to uproot that. If I'm in the evangelical world, that gives so much more credence to the thought process behind people choosing to leave. What they're risking, and the problems are so great that they say fuck it and they do it anyway. That should tell you something.
But it's just because they want to sin.
Well, yeah. Well, first of all,
be able to say fuck on a podcast, right?
That is true. I am just looking to excuse my own use of the F word whenever I fucking feel like it. I'm so shallow that I'm just looking. Yeah, that was John and I, I'll try not to monopolize the conversation, John. But John and I came up in the same way. Obviously, we're brothers. We're not even 2 years apart. But we came up in that world, right? And when we started, I had kind of jumped into the grace thing when John was out of church completely. And when John started kind of dipping his toes back into church, he obviously reached out to me and said, okay, what do you think about this? And I started feeding him some people I was reading at the time who were really into a lot of grace stuff. But that was the accusation level that those of us in that movement at that time was we were just looking to justify our own proclivity to do bad things. I just needed permission. And I'm like, you know what? What a bunch of crap. Way to marginalize and minimize. And John can speak to his own journey and all of that. But I, for one, I don't know. We can talk about, prohibition as being a very bad way to curtail behavior. That when you really kind of embrace some of these ideas, that those things that you used to wrestle with, you don't wrestle with anymore, or they just become non-issues. But anyway.
It works so well with alcohol. We try it with everything else.
Don't we? When Nancy Reagan said in the 80s that we should just say no to drugs, the drug problem just radically disappeared. It just miraculously went away.
Yeah.
And if we ban abortion, it will cease to exist.
Right. And if we just tell gay folks to stop being gay, they'll suddenly find themselves attracted to the appropriate sex.
So let me get John. Let's hear John's voice in here.
Hey, John.
Oh,
John,
hello.
did you guys grow up evangelical?
Oh yeah, I mean, Nat and I have both written about this, and someday someone will get a chance to read our books. But we actually started in a very conservative First Covenant church, which was very liturgical in a way, but also not, right. It was you knew every Sunday the exact form of scripture or of Sunday service you were going to have, right?
Okay.
There was going to be so many hymns. There was going to be some little moment of some kind of conversation, another hymn, and then the message, and then we would all join together to say the prayer, the Our Father prayer, and then that would be the end of the service. And then our parents felt the need to move us to what they considered more contemporary, a contemporary church. And then so we ended up at a Foursquare church that had the audacity to have electric instruments, drums within their worship team, right? Because so we went from organ and piano and a choir to a church that had a full-on like rock band. I mean, it was mind-blowing.
And Foursquare is a little charismatic, right?
Oh yeah, they're like very Pentecostal light, man.
Yeah. What do we call it? Pentecostal, like adjacent.
Yeah, for sure.
But we entered that denomination, or whatever you want to call it, because they really like to say that they're non-denominational, but let's be realistic. They are a denomination, right? But we entered that world just as the pastors were preaching on the end times. I mean, Nat can agree with me on this, that I have heard so many sermons on it will not be in my lifetime, but it will be in your lifetime, that the end of times will happen, that the younger generation will see the second coming of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And it was later in life that I found out that a lot of these people went to Bible college and they were literally trained into speaking in this way. They were told to speak this way and just basically scare the shit out of us.
Yeah.
And to give us this world of, if we are not right with God and we haven't accepted Jesus in the exact way, that we will be left behind.
Said the right magic prayer.
Right. Said the right magic prayer, said the sinner's prayer, which, by the way, not biblical. There's nothing in the Bible that ever has told us that we need to do this. But I'm not going to speak for Nat, but I spent years scared to death that I was going to wake up in the morning and my family was going to be gone because I forgot to say and ask for forgiveness for that one sin that I just forgot about, and this was this idea, right? That you were going to, if you didn't ask for forgiveness for every single little sin that you did throughout the week, you were potentially going to get left behind. And
I can remember somebody playing the song "Cold as Ice" by Foreigner. You guys remember that song?
Yep.
It was cold as ice.
Absolutely. Yep. And loved that song. And I was just praying, Jesus, don't come right now. Don't come right now. Just don't come this second.
Right. So, like, what, before the song got finished, or you didn't want to get caught listening to a secular song? I'm not sure what was the fear there. Don't at least get to the bridge before you come back. Oh my God.
Rock music was evil, man, particularly coming from a jukebox, and to enjoy it, Jesus
there was
that little 9-year-old boy behind, and then I would have to get my head chopped off with the 666, and all that stuff.
I don't know if Nat remembers this, but we were sitting in the kitchen of our house on Little Fairfield, and someone had brought over a Rush album. I want to say it was Fly By Night, which is, by the way, an awesome album.
Of course.
And there's a song on there, and some of the lyrics say something about burning books. And I remember having this moment of like, see, this is like Satan working in the background, trying to convince us that we need to destroy everything that's secular. Even the secular music understands that secular stuff is wrong. And so I remember taking that cassette and breaking it because I had to stop the influence of Satan through this music and this idea that
was my
we were
cassette,
going to
you
be.
son of a bitch.
It probably was. But I mean, how many people have had that moment, right? I mean, I guarantee you, viewers on our podcast, viewers on your podcast, there's numbers and numbers of people who have done what we have done, and that is to destroy our secular record collection in the name of Jesus.
Yeah.
And in some way, that is protecting us from the evils of the rock beat, right? Which, by the way, for anyone who is even remotely interested in this, is super, super racist. And because we want to go after the African beat as something that's satanic.
So you're saying it's racist to call rock music a satanic rhythmic?
Yeah,
absolutely.
I would agree with that.
I have not heard that one before, but
the undertone of that is 1000% racist, because rock and roll music at its base level is African music. It's this rhythmic beat
tribal
that we are told. I mean, how many times have you heard in church that it's not necessarily the music, it's the beat. It's that rock and roll beat that gets you, and it's evil and it's satanic. But at the core of it, it is absolutely 100% racist. And for anybody to deny that, I'm sorry, you haven't done your history into the history of rock and roll music, which is another whole story altogether.
Yeah.
I used to, and you remember, in fact, I saw, John, your video on the satanic panic around Halloween.
Mm-hmm.
You remember backward masking?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
And as a kid, I used to think, like, wow, the devil is so smart and so powerful. I wish God was smart and powerful,
if only, right?
Why is all of the devil's stuff so cool, and he's so able to do all this amazing stuff? And like every church service was a testimony to the greatness of Satan, because man, he could get us so many different ways.
Well, he was just so clever, wasn't he?
Yeah.
I went to a crusade when I was a kid. I don't know if you remember. This will date me some, but David Wilkerson was the guy who wrote the line. I was going to say The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. No, The Cross and the Switchblade. Very different books, by the way. So David Wilkerson wrote The Cross and the Switchblade, which became a real popular movie with that guy from Chips, Eric Estrada, right? So Ponch from Chips does this movie about a guy going in to evangelize gang members. Well, his brother, Rich Wilkerson, was an evangelical preacher, an itinerant preacher, went around doing, crusades and stuff like that. So I remember going to a crusade with him one time, and my mom probably dragged you there too, John. But I certainly got dragged into this tent type situation where this guy is just, man, all he did was go on and on and on about the evils of rock and roll. The problem was he didn't know rock and roll. So the examples he was bringing up were like, we don't even listen to that shit, dude. What are you talking about? Like, you're going to talk about, bands that are 20 years old. You're going to talk about the Eagles. We weren't listening to the Eagles, man. Some of the stuff I was listening to was actually pretty dark. He wouldn't have known the first thing about it, but he got into the whole backward masking thing. And I remember thinking, he actually had a record player on stage, and he would take these records and he would turn them backwards, and he would go, and he's, there it is. It's clearly worship the devil and sacrifice your children. I'm like, it didn't say that. I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. But I had that same kind of thought, and that was the same guy that convinced all of us to take our, go home at night and take our records out in the backyard and, blow them up or something. Or
we had to bring ours to church. I brought a Barry Manilow cassette tape, for God's sakes.
And honestly, good on you, sir. No, I'm just kidding. Barry Manilow's a genius, man.
Should have been destroyed.
Well, they have any issue? Why you got an issue with Barry Manilow, man?
Well, I think it's funny too that as our parents, and like they're going to hear this, but if they hear this, I'm sorry, mom and dad, but as they're telling us that we need to like back away from the evils of rock and roll music, do you remember the first record or album that was purchased for us by our parents?
I'm gonna go on a limb and say it was the Village People.
It was.
Yeah.
Oh,
It was Village People. And if my parents even remotely knew that they were a group of homosexual pop
Thinking about the
stars
wonders of the YMCA, baby.
and
the Navy.
living the world of the Navy, right?
Yeah.
I don't think they would have bought it for us, but they
No.
thought it was like that was the safe alternative to some of the music that we wanted to listen to.
But do you remember the title of their live album? That
Live
Mom
and
bought me?
Sleazy.
Yeah, that she bought me
Live
for like
and
my
Sleazy.
10th birthday. I was like, it's like, I don't understand what this live and sleazy thing is, but here you go.
that's
it was
funny. Well, I
crazy.
thought you were going to say like Striper or somebody like that.
No, well,
maybe.
you know what? For my parents, Christian rock was a salvation. I mean, they never had an issue with it ever. They loved it. They loved that they had an alternative, that they had something they could, that we could listen to that wasn't going to corrupt our brains. We had other family members who were still very, very much opposed to anything rock and roll, and how dare you? Christian rock was an oxymoron.
Yeah, Christian rock was totally evil in our house because that was the devil now masquerading as Christian music.
Yeah, my parents were actually our parents were in a lot of ways very. They weren't super strict, and it just depended. Dad was fine with secular music as long as it was his, so we cut our teeth on the Beatles. No problem. Dad loved the Beatles. I'm like, they could be total psychedelic drug using hippies, but Dad was fine with the Beatles. When he found my Judas Priest cassette tape, he had a hard time, So right around like the 80s, I really got into metal for a while. Then like the mid 80s, really got into like hardcore, like skate punk and, really edgy music, right? Even now you listen to stuff like Misfits and Dead Kennedys and, those kinds of punk bands. And, they weren't fan. I had to hide all that stuff. John and I must have joined the Columbia Record and Tape Club about 10 or 15 times. I probably still owe them a shit ton of money.
Yeah.
You could get like all the records for 2 cents.
Yeah, you could get 11 or 12 cassettes for a penny, as long as you promised to buy like 10 or 12 at the whatever. Remind me what, John?
So when Nat and I were in junior high, so the idea was that we signed up for this, right? Because I think you had to send them a legitimate penny, right? Like taped.
Yeah, you taped a penny to the little thing.
You taped a penny, you mailed that back, and you got to pick like 12 albums, right?
Yep.
But do you remember that we would try to run home after school to beat mom and dad so we could check the mail.
Oh, of course.
So we could get all of our records or tapes out of the mailbox before mom and dad got home. Well, I got caught by dad because he got home before me, and there's this package of cassettes, and he made me sit in my bedroom and put the tapes on and made me go over the lyrics with him.
Wow.
And Tad, he explained to me why these lyrics were not okay. And it just happened to be Quiet Riot. And I think the first song that we had to listen to was Come On, Feel the Noise.
Come on, feel the noise. There you go.
Oh, wow.
Spelled C-U-M, by the way.
Yes,
because,
of course.
They're so edgy.
Did Dad explain that to you?
No. Oh, no.
Okay, I was going to make sure. I want to know how awkward that thing got. Yeah, the Columbia Record Club was the bomb.
Oh, it was awesome.
The best part of it was, and they don't do this anymore, obviously for obvious reasons. I'm like 12, I'm like 13, and in an amazing show of support from my dad, or maybe just self-preservation on his part, when the bill started to finally come due, when they started to threaten to send us to collections and stuff like that, I think my dad got on the phone with one of those guys one day. He's like, "You realized you entered into a contract with a 13-year-old. Good luck." And his name is apparently Francisco de la Hoya. I don't know. We use like 15 different names, man. There was no way to verify any of this stuff.
Oh my gosh.
But my dad was way more pissed off about the music choices than he was the fact that we just deceived some record company to give us a bunch of free tapes. But such was the life of an evangelical kid in the 80s, right? We weren't hiding porn because porn was not accessible. You had to really work. You kids in the 2000s and the 2020s and the y'all with your easily accessible porn, you got it made. John and I had to go hunt. Oh man, it was
no
rough,
doubt,
dude.
No doubt.
So the best we could do was semi-illicit rock and roll cassette tapes. Couldn't do the records; they were too big and too hard to hide. So the cassettes were a nice little convenient way to.
Well, you
skip
you
that
could
fast
check
run
the magazine rack at the
You
local
could.
convenience store.
Oh,
We
but
had a
yeah.
scam for
Yeah.
that, you know, distract
somebody
the
could
guy at the front, so you could, yeah, for sure.
let me pull us back on track here.
Yeah,
Although I love
please
those-
do.
I love those.
You're gonna need to do that more than once this evening, I
And,
bet.
and I, you're taking me down memory lane, which I love. And we were talking about bookstores and video stores.
Oh,
Which,
man.
oh gosh, I miss both of those now.
Me too.
Yeah.
But, God knows I love streaming, but yeah, I miss the stores. But tell me about This Is Not Church. This is the podcast. How did you guys come up with this, and what is the mission of the podcast?
Well, so the long and short of it is it was John's idea. It was. I mean, I'm not even being glib. It really was. Pretty much from start to finish. We had befriended, both John and I had befriended Jason Elam. And if you don't know you know who he is, but if you haven't listened to a Messy Spirituality podcast, check it out. And actually, John and I had both been interviewed on his podcast way before we had any reason to be, just because Jason's a nice guy. And so John had gotten this idea to start a podcast, and the idea would be to sort of come at this, the questions of church that are sometimes ignored or pushed aside, but to come at it from two different perspectives, and the perspectives being one guy who's still inside the church and one guy who's left it. So there's one guy who's in the church, me, who's still hanging on by a thread, who still pastors a very, very small church that I have whittled down to just a handful of members now. And John, who's just said, yeah, to hell with all of it. But we still both are enamored of the Jesus story, right? We're both still captivated by everything that Jesus proposes and everything that he stands for. We just can't stand the institutions anymore. Yeah. And so when it came time for John and I both to kind of go through this deconstructive process where we're having to reevaluate how we feel about our LGBTQ friends and family, and how do we reconcile that with a quote unquote biblical worldview, whatever the hell that is, issues of race and white nationalism and, all kinds of other stuff. We just wanted to have a place where we would elevate the kinds of voices that we didn't think were getting played other places. That makes sense. So actually, what was really funny was John called me, texted me, whatever he did, and started talking about this podcast. And I'll let him tell you the rest of that. That's a good story too. But within the first, 2 or 3 episodes, we'd recorded, we noticed this trend. I'm like, there's just a bunch of white dudes on our list of people to interview. Yeah. And so John had reached out and said, man, we've got to do better. Like, we've got to be more intentional about finding, a variety of voices to talk to, and make sure we don't just end up with a bunch of old white theologians, which are all guys that we know and we love. There's none of them that we wouldn't have on the show. But we wanted to be more intentional about the kinds of voices we were seeking to listen to. So that was the deal. We had had some really good luck. I had early on with just making a lot of friends on Facebook, people who had written books and who were, becoming friends of ours through social media. So guys like Paul Young, who wrote The Shack, Brad Jersak, Keith Giles, Dr. Baxter Kruger. There's all these, I've just named like 4 white dudes. But we had really good luck in the beginning. We just started shotgunning invitations to be on this podcast and see, if by and large, they all said yes. And then as it's gone forward, John's done a tremendous job making inroads with other publishers. And so we've actually begun to have people who solicit us to send us their books and want to come on the show. And I'll let John tell his side of that story. But from my perspective, it was something that John wanted to do. And I was like, yeah, okay, sure. That sounds great. And he did all the work.
Yeah. Well, I've told the story, a few times. And for me, I was an associate pastor, worship pastor of a church. And I was starting to realize that my voice and what I wanted to say wasn't really in line with the church. But I had a lot of respect for the pastor, and I still do. We're still friends. We are absolutely friends. But I had a conversation with him, which just happened to be on National Coming Out Day. I did not plan it that way. But I went to him and I was like, hey, there's just so many aspects of what we are doing in the church that I don't agree with. And I would never want to disrespect you and your church, but I can't move forward without speaking out about the LGBTQIA plus community, without speaking out about the BIPOC community, and the Black Lives Matter movement, all of that. I feel like I am being asked to step back from what I really want to say. And at this time, it was coming up on Lent, and I chose to give up the Bible for Lent. So I gave up the Bible.
Wow.
I didn't open it. I didn't use
and
it.
this was a Baptist church, right?
Yes. Yeah. This was a Southern Baptist church. So I gave up the Bible for Lent because I started to realize that I was very, very good at using the Bible to destroy people, specifically people who I thought were being racist, homophobic. I could throw a verse out just as easily as they could to destroy them. And I was like, what are we gaining here? It's just two people or multiple people using the Bible against each other and gaining nothing. So I was like, how about we have a conversation without the Bible, without using it? Just you, me, conversation. I won't throw any Bible verses at you. You won't throw any Bible verses at me. Well, at the end of Lent, I was like, I'm absolutely good with this. I'm done with the Bible. I don't want to read it anymore. So I was like, so what do I do with this? Where do I go with this? And so I started writing a blog, and I wanted the blog to be about somebody who had zero access to the Bible. And it's like, how do you do that in this day and age? How do you do that? So I wrote this like weird sci-fi adventure where this guy ends up in space alone on this ship with no access to any books. And in this conversation that's happening on this spaceship by himself, he ends up having a conversation with God. And so this conversation happens between God and this person with no biblical context, just conversation. Well, I thought this could go on forever. But as the year ended, I realized that I was kind of done with it. It needed to come to a conclusion. So I wrote a really good conclusion. And at the end of that, I was like, well, what do I do now? What do I do with this? What do I do with this information that I've gleaned over this last year? And that's when I went to reach out to Nat, and I was like, so I've been listening to the Messy Spirituality podcast, Heretic Happy Hour, the Bible for Normal People, multiple podcasts. I was like, you know what? I think we can do this. I think we have a voice that's actually going to work in this world. So I reached out to Nat. I was like, hey, this is, I think, the next step is to take this idea where you're still in a church, you have access to that side of it. You are trying to break down the structure from inside, and I am literally throwing the proverbial bombs, right, from outside. And I think we have a really cool idea here if you're willing to step into it with me. And to Nat's credit, he's like, yeah, sure, let's do it. Let's absolutely do it.
Let's make sure we get that right, though. I said, yeah, as long as you do all the work, I'm fine with it. And that has been our arrangement ever since. You podcast, you understand the intricacies of what goes on here. John and I had no idea, and maybe you didn't when you started either. You can start very naively and go, well, how hard can it be? Very goddamn hard. It's tough.
Making the podcast is not hard.
No, that's not hard at all. That was
making it be heard and successful.
Yeah, well, and even producing something that doesn't look hackneyed and dumb, right? So we did our. If anyone's interested, go on wherever you get your podcast fix, and go back and listen to like our first, second, and I think just our first two.
No, I think it was 5. I think it was 5. I think we did 5. Yeah.
We got through a handful of episodes before we. John and I were already talking about, okay, we need an editor. Like, this is not working for us. It's John and I both have full-time jobs. And so John was doing all of the work as far as editing everything and trying to put it together. And it was around that time that Jason Elam had decided to shut his Messy Spirituality podcast down for, I think at the time he was like, I'm done with this. He shut it down. And
well, he was also going through long COVID.
Yeah,
so he was dealing with that.
But he put us in touch with his editor and said, hey, this guy might be looking for some work because I'm about to cut him loose for a while. And so we hooked up with Eric, aka the podcast doctor, And
Nice.
man, I tell you what, the difference was immediate. So yeah, the rest has just been good. I don't know. I'm not sure what to attribute whatever, whatever level of success we have, or it all comes through connections, as you know.
Yeah.
We've been fortunate in some of the people that we've met and who have been generous and who've said
Well,
yes when we asked them. And I've had a chance to talk to some of my heroes, man. So my heroes might not be the same as some, but I really wanted to talk to Douglas Campbell because he's one of the greatest Pauline theologians alive. And I was able to talk to him. We've had a chance to talk to Brian Zond. We've had Brian McLaren on the show. John Dominic Crossan's been on the show. I mean,
Nice.
people that to me are like these intellectual giants, and some, Douglas Campbell in particular. We're trying desperately to get David Bentley Hart to come on. I think he's going to. Peter Enns is going to come on pretty soon. So we've just been, and in the middle of all of that, other people, other names, and other voices have been coming to the party.
Oh yeah,
and we're like,
and then so
who
and
is
then
this Lisa Sharon Harper? She's amazing. Oh my God, December Rose is.
I say I'm
brilliant.
glad to hear a woman's name finally.
Oh no,
popped up.
you go through and
no, and so
I mean-
sadly or not sadly, I don't know how to say this, but we had to be intentional, right? There was an intentionality behind the people that we reached out to, and so I was like, and like Nat said earlier, we have a lot of middle-aged white guys.
Yeah, because there was the people we knew.
It's like, but we
That's our
need to
network,
like
right?
actively reach out to people like Felicia Merle. We
Yeah.
need to actively reach out to people like Lisa Sharon Harper.
Right.
We need to actively reach out to, and honestly, I'm going to
Diana
now
Bass,
Diana Butler Bass, and I'm Christina Cleveland,
Kristen Dumais.
Kristen Dumais.
Well, I had her on. She's
Isn't she, man?
talk
about a
John
genius.
Wayne. Great
Bio,
book.
and Bio Okomolafe, and I just messed up his last name.
Bio Okomolafe.
Okomolafe.
Amazing.
And then
Kristen
Robin
Espinosa,
which they just changed their name, I believe. So they are now, they were they them, and they are now he him. So reaching out to people within the LGBTQIA plus community, reaching out to people in the BIPOC community, and being absolutely intentional on this. And I'm not ashamed or afraid to say that. Unfortunately, in this society, we have to be intentional. We have to reach out to these people on purpose to give them the voice that is so other communities just deny them.
Well, and just to make sure that our perspectives don't remain, curtailed and I mean the whole point of talking to folks like that is just twofold. Obviously, to provide a platform for people we don't think get enough attention, but also to shape our own perspectives. So the more conversations I have with people whose stories I don't know real well, or whose vocabulary I don't even know that well. The first time we had somebody on the program who was trans, John and I were like, we have to make sure we get this right.
Right.
Like I don't want to offend, when Bio Okomolafe came on the show, I asked him 3 times how to say his name. I don't want to say your name wrong, and in a very Nigerian way, he says, oh, if you had said my name wrong, it would just be another way to say my name, which I still think is beautiful. But so that was that's been the biggest and best surprise of all of this is just the quality of people we get to meet.
And what I've loved being freed up from that satanic panic again, like
exactly.
That I've been able to have witches on my podcast.
Yeah.
I've been able to have a Buddhist on my podcast.
We had an atheist on the show one time and we didn't burst into flames.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And once you and I heard President Biden say this in talking with I think Dylan Mulvaney, the trans influencer that was one of the influencers in the room,
great conversation. Whoever has not heard that conversation needs to go out and hear that conversation. It's absolutely awesome.
And Joe Biden's not my favorite guy.
No.
He got it right.
But his empathetic interaction with her was so beautiful. And I do think he has that in him as a person, but what he said was, once we get around some people from these other people groups and say, you're the thing that I was told to be afraid of.
Yeah.
You're the person all of a sudden you're not afraid of that anymore.
Yeah.
And hopefully I want to do that through my podcast sometimes, is get people in proximity to voices that they would never hear otherwise.
Yeah.
Well, you get interesting conversations, like with our conversation with Felicia Merle when I'm talking about.
She's great too. I love
I
her.
love her
and
so
so
much. Yeah.
and the conversation kind of steered towards missionaries going to Africa, right, and trying to save the savage, right? And she's
Yeah.
like, and one of her comments was, "You realize we knew about Jesus before you did, right?"
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that conversation, the conversation with Christina Cleveland, and she wrote the book God is a Black Woman. And unfortunately, we said this before we recorded, but I made a comment to her that I was like, the book was hard to read. And she's like, good, it wasn't meant for you.
Right.
And I was like, me 10 years ago would be super offended by that. Me today is like, you're right. This book wasn't written for me. This book was written for other people of color to realize that the Black Madonna that's all over Europe has so much importance than this whitewashed version of whatever you want to call this within the Christian faith or within the Catholic faith or whatever you want to call it, that we've created this white dominant version of Jesus, the Virgin Mary, all of that. And so it's a freeing moment when I have someone tell me, well, this wasn't written for you.
Yeah.
Thank you for having on the podcast.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I don't know if you guys know who Joe Lumen is, who's a TikTok influencer and a social media influencer, but she is, I had her on the podcast, and she's from, I think, Colombian originally. And I'm so sorry if I have that wrong. From a South American country, and came to the United States. Her family became evangelical. She became an evangelical ordained minister, and now, kind of like the guys on the screen, is like, I'm out from that. But in a conversation with her is very hard, because she says white Euro evangelicalism or white Euro Christianity is a colonizing religion. You are colonizing people, and you kind of want to go, that's not totally.
But I'm
true.
not.
Yeah, not me, not my church.
Yeah.
But we need to feel that pain every once in a while, don't we?
Yeah, we do. Yeah. And, I remember talking to say like Lisa Sharon Harper, and she's talking about these generations of her family that she can trace back to some of the first race laws that were written in America, that were written in Maryland, and it's all predicated on a construct of whiteness that has been set up as the example by which we contrast and compare everything. And so, and even for a woman like her, who's a person of color who grows up, she finds that over her lifetime, that's become internalized for even for her. And so her first act of rebellion has to be to break out of that system entirely and say, and then what she did for us, the gift she gave John and I was, it's like, listen, whiteness has robbed you of your ethnicity.
Yeah.
Whiteness has taken that from you, because you've just become, you've gotten lumped in with a construct that doesn't exist. It's not even a real thing. And then you've lost, and I felt that a lot of times in my lifetime, where there was some envy somewhat with people who had ethnicity, to pull from. And I didn't have any of that. I just had this sort of loosely defined whiteness. Okay, great. You're white. Don't get me wrong. That came with all kinds of privilege. And, now that I'm 50 something, I understand that. But man, what a gift. What I loved about what she did there was she didn't take that and then weaponize that against me. She took that concept and she gave it back to me and said, listen, this didn't just happen to us. This happened to you too. You should be pissed off as well. Yeah. I'm like, God bless America. That's amazing. Yeah. So I would have never had, I don't know how long it would have taken me to come to that kind of conclusion without a voice like that.
And the sad thing is, in this season, we all want to be defensive. Like you say, no, that's not me, when instead we ought to say, hit me with it.
Yeah.
Hit me with it and let me challenge my heart. And I'll tell you where this really hit me was with a rabbi friend that I befriended along the way here, who said, by the way, that you guys have appropriated our scripture.
Yeah.
Like you have appropriated Jewish text. And so, and again, I was like, what? Come on. But
no, we're family.
I realized he's right. Even by saying Old Testament, I I am taking somebody else's holy text and making it something that I can use and abuse for, and what the evangelical church does, abuse it for political purposes now.
Well, yeah, because
which is horrific when you think about it.
We've taken their holy scriptures and we've weaponized it against them.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean,
and the other thing we've done, though,
have done that.
When you think about deconstruction, I just did I'm doing some research because Jacques Derrida, the father of actual deconstruction, which had nothing to do with the religious structures but had everything to do with textual meaning, would say that we've created binaries, and in our binaries we've created hierarchies. And so even inside of an Old and a New Testament, we've subordinated the old to the new.
Yeah.
And we've said, I got taken to task the other day on Facebook. And by the way, I don't mind it, man. But I got taken to task for something I posted as being, unknowingly anti-Semitic. And it was Leo Walters, you know that person, John. Anyway, so because I know the person and I respect them, I said, okay, let me think about that for a second. I didn't intend for it to be that way, but I had made a offhanded sort of disparaging comment about, the old way. Like we used to do it this way. I think the post had something to do with, we used to try and contain God in a temple. Now we contain him in a book. I stand by the statement, right? Although I will concede that to some ears that will sound as though I've disparaged, and I'm like, you know what? But I am open. And I know John is. John's really good at this. I'm open to the critiques, especially to the critiques from people who have normally been marginalized and critiqued themselves. I would much rather hear from them. Does that make sense? If you're a privileged middle-aged cisgendered white dude sitting in your ivory tower and you're pissed off because I'm not bowing to your authority, well then you can get bent. But when somebody like Leo comes along and says, "Hey, you might want to reconsider how you're saying this. Think about what you're," man, I need that. I know John. Yeah. I know John does. I know you do as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, I had during the Black Lives Matter protests, I was very, very vocal in the side of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I made and honestly, I can't tell you what it was now because I really don't remember, but I made some comment on Facebook like you do when you're a white guy.
And you want to get likes.
Right. And so you make some random statement right before you go to bed, right? Because you don't really want to see the comments, but you want to sound like you're an ally. And I did that. And then I went to bed with no cares in the world because it doesn't affect me.
Yeah.
And I woke up to the proverbial shit hitting the fan. And I had private messages and messages from a BIPOC friend or Facebook friend of mine, basically calling me to task. You cannot do this and then not defend what you say. You look like every other single person who's ever done this. Because you haven't spoken up. You haven't spoke out against the racist comments that are coming onto your Facebook post. And my first thought was, I was asleep. How am I supposed to defend this? But then I had to take a step back and from the perspective of my BIPOC siblings, what does it look like when I don't comment at all at these horrendous racist comments that are being thrown, these accusations that are being thrown at them on my post? And I have said shit. I've said nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this, that whole thing of, being transformed by the renewing of our minds is like, we should be offended every once in a while. And when Jesus said, "Eat my flesh and drink my blood," I sort of facetiously say he said this to people that didn't eat pork or shrimp.
They were super offended.
I see that as intentionally offending people to see, are you in it until I don't affirm your beliefs anymore?
Yeah.
Right. And so I think that's a great demonstration from Jesus. Like, let yourself be offended And what I always kind of say about that story is then he turns to the guys, his guys, and he's like, "What about you? You guys leaving?" And,
Yeah.
and
They're like, where else would we go, man?
Their response to me is like, if I had somewhere else to go
I
now,
would
I would
go.
be the
Yeah, I
fuck
love
outta
that.
here.
I never read that as any kind of affirmation of what Jesus said. They were just like, listen, where else are we going to go, dude? We've already thrown our lot in with you.
That's right.
We're all
stuck
totally
now.
screwed, right? So yeah, we're with you, man.
And
But
so
I-
and you're right, because as a pastor, and particularly for me in the Obama era, when I saw how cruel we were as right-wing Christians, what I now call right-wing Christians, to President Obama. And I'm trying to say, this isn't us. And then when Trump comes and it's like, oh wait, this is us.
Yeah.
And as I tried to speak out against that as a senior pastor of a church that we founded in 2008, my staff would look at me with their, deer in the headlight look of like, how are we going to pay salaries next month, or next week, or
Sure.
if you're saying these things. And so, I had to get out for that. But it's interesting that you guys are still doing this inside and outside the church kind of conversation.
We say that, and yet I'm failing, so that's okay. It's all right. This is not an example of how you do this well.
Yeah.
When I planted my church 3 years ago, I had about 85 or 90 people. I'm not joking. I'm literally down to about a half dozen to a dozen who are still with me.
I would like to, let me say this about Nat, because
no, you don't have to.
No, hold on. I'm going to say this about you because no, you won't say it because
you don't know. I'm kind of a braggart.
But what Nat has done, and yeah, maybe he's only bringing 12 people along with him, but he has broken down the system to the point where, yeah, it's 12 people, but they're 12 people who get it.
Yeah. And
maybe someday it'll be 25 people who get it.
Yeah, maybe.
And it doesn't need to be big. It really doesn't.
No, and it really doesn't. No,
and
you're right.
That's when I was doing the pastoring thing a few years ago. I mean, I played the game, right? I mean, when I stepped into this church, the first day that I took on the role as worship leader, there were 12 people in this church, and my goal was, by God, by the end of the month, I'm going to double this, and then we're going to move forward from there. And it became that's all I did. I started like calculating numbers of how many people showed up, how many people we got each week. And I was showing the percentage of increase, right? And I never showed anybody this, but I had it on my phone.
Yeah.
And that's when I started realizing, okay, I'm really, really messing up here. I would rather talk to 12 people who get it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Than 1,000 people who are there because they feel like there's some kind of blessing in their future if they continue to tithe and listen to this pastor as they say what they say. I am no longer connected with that. I'm no longer connected with the church at all.
Yeah.
But
what
Nat is doing, and right now he's saying it's 12 people. But
I tease. I was raised to be self-deprecating, so that's what I'm. But I am being honest about all of that. I will say that I left a church of 1,000 or so. I left probably the second or third biggest church in my town, where I was on staff, but I got tired of it. I got tired of the game, and I left ostensibly to do something different. And I'm sorry, my cat is stepping on my keyboard. Ignore whatever chat comes through there, man. He has things to say, but anyway. But I found myself within the first 3 or 4 months of planting this new church chasing the same stuff.
Yeah,
like we were still sitting around going, man, we're doing pretty good. Look at the numbers are up. And honestly, for us, COVID was a bit of a blessing in disguise.
Yeah.
Because it just forced us to rethink everything. It forced us to redefine success. It forced us to redefine what we were even doing as a church. And the other reason I left that church ostensibly, I've used the word ostensibly twice now, John. That's impressive.
It is very impressive.
Both times properly, yes.
Well, yeah. So I was also raised by a man who loves words, so I learned. But no, I'm just kidding. But I left so that I could be free to say what I wanted to say. Yeah. I felt constrained inside the system of a church where I was not the leader. I didn't want to undermine what was going on there. So anyway, but I still found myself like self-censoring because like how far do I want to go?
Yeah.
Like and then again, COVID happened, and I'm like, you know what am I protecting? Who am I protecting?
Yeah.
So at that point, my associate pastor and myself, my best friend Todd, we're like, you know what, we're not going to dance around these topics anymore. We're going to say what we think. We're going to be honest with people and not bait and switch them. Because I always felt like there was a lot of that going on in the church where, people are paying lip service to things like inclusion. But the doctrines they believe in are anything but.
Yeah.
They may never use the word hell in a sermon, but I know for sure they think y'all are going there. And so, I got to a point where I'm just going to be honest about how I feel about this. I think hell is a myth, and a pagan one at that. I think it defames the character and nature of God. And if you believe it, I think you should rethink it. The things we've done to our gay brothers and sisters is abominable. And go down the list.
We use the Bible, as John was saying.
And we use the Bible to justify it. And so
that's one that's always, and I had to dig into that one because I would probably be always sort of a side B Christian of like, I want gay people to come to my church. I love them, but I would never marry them. I would never, and all of those things. And finally, just the very blatant fact of there are 6 passages that I think all are abused and misinterpreted and misused, but 6
in all of Scripture,
in all of the Bible, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of passages that say, take care of the poor, the marginalized, which I believe the LGBTQ plus qualify for that biblically, the foreigner, which is really funny.
Oof,
and then the widow, which I read as those that don't have access to the economic system or economic opportunity. And so how are we demonizing this one group of people with 6 passages and becoming Republicans over it, and then missing all the rest of it?
Well, and on top of that, we specifically within the evangelical church tell people that we are under the new covenant, right? The old covenant no longer means anything, but then we're sure as hell willing to throw out Leviticus, right? Which we just recently said doesn't have any power over us because we are under the new covenant. But then we use Leviticus against our LGBTQIA plus siblings.
John, you still got people using, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth to justify the death penalty. So, I mean, these are. I'm over the ignorance of people who don't even try to masquerade their hate anymore. I'll tell you a quick story. I think we had just planted the church. I don't want to give the impression that I've always been so open-minded about our LGBTQIA plus friends. I have never hated anybody. But I've still towed the party line because that's what I was supposed to do. And so I had a really good friend, not intentionally, but sort of semi-intentionally put me on blast because she was going to get married to her wife, who she married, and asked me to marry her. And I had to say no. And it put me into a tailspin. It put me into a real crisis of faith because I went home that night, bawled my eyes out, told my wife, what the hell am I doing? Like something's not right here. Like, why don't I have the courage to do this? She's my friend, and I told her no. And it's still, to me, one of my more grievous offenses, right? She's still my friend. She still loves me. She still went and got married. And I've thanked her repeatedly for, I needed that focal point. I needed something to put me in a place of decision. Like, hey, you're either going to be all in with your words and your deeds, or you're a fraud.
Well, here's the interesting part of all this, right? They are so quick to forgive us.
Yeah.
And we are so quick to demonize them.
Yeah.
All we got to do is tell them that we made a mistake, and they are so quick to forgive us.
So Lainey, if you're listening, sorry, I'll tell Lainey later on she can listen. But.
So and it's like it's one of those things. It's so asinine that they all they want to be, and I use the word they, and I hate it, right? Because it creates this other them. All people want is to be loved and accepted, and they are so quick to forgive us for our missteps. Yeah, and at the same time, we are so quick to tell them they're going to hell.
Yeah.
And I am no longer okay with that.
And Jesus was hated for the people he hung out with by religious people.
Yeah.
And I just say, if you're not hated by religious people for who you hang out with and defend and affirm, you are not a follower of Christ. Your life does not look like Jesus' life. Period.
Yeah, you should be in trouble a lot.
Yeah.
Right? Like you should routinely be ruffling the feathers of stuffy religious folks.
You should literally be called out almost daily for the people you hang out with.
Well, and I think we like it. We like all that stuff as, as a meme when we say, I'd rather be excluded for who I include than included for who I exclude.
Yeah.
I've had long conversations with pastor friends of mine who, I think on in some part of their heart and their mind, they agree with a lot of this, but they're just constrained by the structures they live inside of, and by the fact that they're dependent on it for their livelihoods.
Absolutely. I have pastor friends reach out to me from time to time and say, keep doing what you're doing. I can't say what you say, but it needs to be.
And then I wonder, well, then, God, what are we, So if I did anything right by getting away from that part of a church structure, we don't have paid clergy. I'm not saying I don't believe in it, but I pretty closely don't believe in it. I'm pretty close to thinking it's not right.
Well, and I am convinced church should not be in a building.
Yeah.
Because, for a whole lot of reasons, but one of which and we want to say, oh, pastors should never do this, but you can't help it. You've got to pay rent. You've got to pay salaries. And at times you end up compromising. So people don't get upset, butthurt, and leave.
So
you gotta pay rent and salary.
Well, I'm
gonna hold on. Because I wanna speak at the goodness of Nat again. Let's do this. So what Nat has done is, yes, he has a church building, but the church doesn't pay for the church building. There is no money coming from the church to cover the cost of their rent to be there. What Nat has done is he's opened a coffee shop. The coffee shop pays the rent. The coffee shop pays for everything. And the church itself pays for nothing.
I love it.
The church is not any way felt the need to bow down to anybody. And so
I don't know anything. Yeah. Now,
Nat's not gonna say anything about this because that's not what Nat does. But Nat doesn't take a salary from the church. Nat takes a salary from the coffee shop that he has created.
Well, that was an investment of my money into my business, and I figured that was a way of creating some space where we could be free to be who we wanted to be, and then not be dependent upon an income stream, right?
And so it allows you to say what the hell you want.
In all honesty, for the first little, we've only recently gotten to a place where the church doesn't pay anything. I don't even take up a collection anymore, because even passing a plate is coercive to me. So I just don't need it. If money does come in and people do want to give, it goes right back out the door into something community, something local that we can do. But
and then we don't violate 501c3 laws and all those things.
Yeah, and I'm not a 501c3. I'm not. I pay taxes on my building. I pay taxes on my business. I think a lot of that stuff is just a scam. The beautiful part about all of this is that it frees us up to be who we want to be. I have friends who have churches, and I know their budgets are in the millions. And they lose sleep every single night because they have to make salary, they have to make payroll, they have to make rent, they have to pay their utilities. There's all this stuff that has to happen, and they're just constricted and constrained somewhat, and they don't have any liberty to say what they want to say, and it's too bad. And so, they're nice people, they're good people, but I still feel like they're victims of the same system that we've tried to break free from.
And I tell people, I used to say this in the church too. It's like, if you want to get a tax deduction for your giving into the kingdom of heaven, isn't that getting your reward on earth, not in heaven?
I've actually had people come. I've actually had people come and want to give us large gifts, and then said, and then when I've told them I'm not a 501c3, they went, oh, and some have still given and some have decided not to, because there's no tax break for them in that. And that's okay. We have survived for all, for these 3 years so far. No one's getting rich, thank God. And again, I probably shouldn't say this as a guy who pastors a church, but I'm a bit indifferent about the whole thing. And maybe that's a good thing too, because if it folded up tomorrow, I'm okay. Like if we closed our doors tomorrow and we never had church in that building again, I'm not so wrapped up in it that my identity would be crushed and I don't know what to do next. And I would go, too many of my pastor friends, I don't know what they would do. Yeah. Too much of who they are is wrapped up in that role that they play. And I've tried very hard to demystify all of that and say, the role of a pastor is not, I don't speak with any authority. I don't have any special anointing. I'm just a guy walking a road I'll share some things with you along the way that I've figured out. And nice. You can agree or not. That's great. But we're all just,
I want to give you guys a chance to plug your books here for sure. John, you have a book coming out called Parenting Deconstructed that you've done with some other folks. I'll put the link up, but tell us about this book.
So Jason Elam and his wife, Brandy Elam, came to a lot of us and asked if we'd be willing to write a chapter for this book called Parenting Deconstructed. And it's just, first of all, I need to explain that for me, deconstruction is so different because I left the church at such an early age. That wasn't a word. There was no word called deconstruction. I didn't know what that was. All I was told was I was on a slippery slope, right? I've left the church behind. I was in a lot of ways evil incarnate, a false prophet, all those kinds of things when I left. Yeah. And so Jason, when he came to us and asked us to write chapters for this book, it was, how do you parent post deconstruction? How do you bring your family along as you are trying to figure out who you are as a parent?
Yeah.
And so for me, in my chapter in this book, I felt the need to go back a couple generations and talk about my grandparents and talk about my parents and this idea of generational curses, which I don't buy into, but I wholeheartedly believe in generational trauma. And so there's this idea that I am who I am because of the trauma that my grandparents went through and the trauma that my parents went through. And then they put that on me and I parent from there. And as I let go of this biblical perspective and try to see my children as human beings who are autonomous and can make decisions for themselves and acknowledge that, that's where my chapter goes in this book. So Parenting Deconstructed is, it's an awesome book. And I'm going to apologize for authors who have been in it, but we got chapters by Derek Day. We have chapters by Jason and Brandy Elam, Carl Forehand, Laura Forehand, the Akers, Ben DeLong, I'm sorry, and many others.
Many others.
December
and
Rose.
That's not all.
And that's not all.
So follow the link, pre-order the book, because I'm post having kids, that are not adults, but doesn't mean that I have stopped parenting, right? I have a 23-year-old child. I have a 20-year-old child. I have an 18-year-old child, but it doesn't mean I've stopped parenting. And the chapters in this book give us perspective into the mistakes that we made and that we are acknowledging, and the way that we can maybe look at the way we wish we had parented our kids if we had just stepped back and realized that a relationship with our children is way more important than a relationship with a church.
Amen.
Yeah. And so that's, I think, where this is going to be really helpful for a lot of people.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it's good stuff.
Yeah. And Nat, you have a book or two, don't you?
Well, no, I have no books. I
No
have
books.
one.
Okay.
No, I have a book that will be coming out on Choir next year. Signed a contract just the other day, as a matter of fact. So,
Nice.
but we're in the final stages of that. It's actually about deconstruction as well. Go figure. It's the topic du jour.
It seems
But
to be the topic of the day.
my book is called The Seeds of Deconstruction, riffing off of a Thomas Merton book called The Seeds of Destruction. But for me, this deconstruction was and has been at times cataclysmic. It's not been, it's not been, all puppy dogs and fairy tales and rainbows. There's been some real grief involved and some real pain that has come along with it. And so for me, it's just about it's equal parts memoir. It's absolutely not. I was going to joke that it was like a 12-step how to deconstruct, but I don't want that to come off wrong. It's that would be a huge mistake. Please, no one write a book like that. Dear God. If there's anything we've learned about any of this process that we've all gone through, it's that it's so unique and so individual. You couldn't possibly come up with a formula for it. But these are just my observations, things that I have deconstructed, things that that I'm still working towards. But yeah, it should be coming out next year. Brad Jersak wrote the foreword for me.
Nice.
Got a couple of lovely endorsements from my other white male friends. So if you're a non-white male friend, call me. I'd like your endorsement too. But no, I'm excited about it, and it's something that I've been working on for some time. So Keith and Matt DeStefano at Choir have been very cool. And yeah,
well,
doing
I've had the joy of I've had the pleasure and joy of reading it, and it is a remarkable book.
And I know John has said a lot of nice things about you today.
I know, and I've said I have not reciprocated.
Well, and I know I'm biased on this book, but when this book comes out, it's a well needed book for people who have who've gone through deconstruction but don't know where to go next and feel like they feel the need to reconstruct. And I think Nat and I and you, Paul, I think realize that reconstruction is not necessarily a process that's going to happen anytime soon. I have gone through deconstruction now multiple times. I've deconstructed my deconstruction.
Yeah.
And I don't see that stopping. I really don't. And I think the moment we stop deconstructing and not and asking the hard questions is the time we're kind of in trouble.
Yeah, I agree.
It's so good. I literally had a pastor friend tell me, I know you're deconstructing, but what are you reconstructing? Because, and he had said earlier in the conversation, like, we go through this about every 25 years or so. We had the Jesus movement, we had the emergent church. He was sort of poo-pooing the whole thing, and I thought about it, as the conversation was going along, and finally I circled back at some point and had a semi-salient moment and said, maybe we're not supposed to reconstruct, just as you were saying, John. Maybe we keep going through this process because we keep rebuilding the same damn thing that we're supposed to be tearing down and leave it torn down.
Yeah.
And let future generations pick it up and do something totally new with it.
Well, we had was it Bayo Okomolafe was on the show. And,
we always rebuild what we know.
Yeah. And that was and that's exactly was his point was, don't rush off to reconstruct something.
Well, and then
you're not far enough away from it to not just rebuild something that looks exactly like what was there before. You'll delude yourself into thinking it's different, but the truth is it won't be.
And I think some of that is we're afraid of discomfort.
Yeah, I think it's equal parts we're afraid, and I think the other part is we just don't know how to do otherwise.
Yeah,
it's so deeply ingrained in us to do things a certain way. So I think I think what I say in the book is that we should just tear the whole fucking thing down, let the ground sit fallow for a generation or two.
Yep.
And I think I said exactly what you just said, and let future generations reimagine this thing completely without all of the baggage that we might put on it. And even they'll get it wrong too. I get it, but yeah, I'm scared to death of reconstruction. I don't. Yeah. Well, look what it did to the United States. So how did we do in Reconstruction when we reconstructed after the Civil War?
Just to throw this in there, I always say Jesus said, and I know my Jewish friends don't like me saying this, but he said, not one stone of that thing's going to stand on another.
Yeah.
And he didn't say, pray that doesn't happen. You know, pray
or
that
pray
God.
that we rebuild it when it's over.
Yeah.
No.
Well, and it was either you, Nat, or someone else. I can't remember who said it. Was like the moment we see a church of deconstruction.
Yeah, that was me. I'll know this thing's over.
Then this movement, and that's in quotes, is over, and it's time to move on.
Welcome to the first church of the deconstructed.
Right. I pray, I hope that we never see that.
Doesn't it feel sometimes like that's what the Apostle Paul did? Like, there was this way happening, and he's like, we need to put a structure around this. Or somebody took his letters and said, we need to build a structure around it.
And one of those things that as I try to not do that thing that we do, which is sort of separate Jesus and Paul from their Jewishness, right? We thrust them into this, especially Paul, into a sort of superhuman place. Paul was still learning, man. Yeah. Paul had a cultural milieu in which he lived. He had habits and ways of thinking that had to be broken over time as well. Which is why I think we can take a look at a lot of his letters and go, I think you might have got that one wrong, Paul. I think that one's okay. Yeah. But I think you were slipping into your religious mindset when you said this. But we've divinized and deified the Bible so much that we we can't take those kinds of liberties. How dare we? Like, who are you to question the Holy Scriptures?
Well, it's that question, right? It's like, if we had the opportunity to talk to Paul and say, do you know that all these letters that you wrote to specific churches at a specific moment in time would be considered the holy scripture of
we'd put it on the same level as the Torah, and he'd be like, God forbid.
Like, what the hell is wrong with you?
Like, you're kidding, right? Yeah. Like, that letter I wrote to Corinth?
Yeah, the one where I said, this is just my opinion, people. Yeah. And you've all took that as, what a bunch of, he'd probably be like, oi. No.
And you know what? Like, and I appreciate you fasting from the Bible, John, but for me, once I untethered from the inerrancy, I realized the silliness. I just say that's a silly belief, to believe that we have an English translation of a,
of an ancient text,
of a Greek written text of a Jewish guy talking about Hebrew scripture, like
who spoke Aramaic.
Who spoke Aramaic, exactly. And just to be able to say this was written by humans, and they were learning as they go. They were figuring it out, that the God we're told about in the Bible was written about by Bedouin farmers 6,000 years ago that didn't know the Western Hemisphere existed.
Right.
We can see it all differently, and we can start to have, I think, a vibrant relationship.
Well, and it's much more interesting.
Yeah.
Like, it's much more interesting if I tell people, I preach this from my pulpit. I'm like, I believe in the inerrancy of Scripture. In that, I believe that the Scripture inerrantly shows us what people thought about God at a certain place in time. It doesn't mean they were right, but I think one thing that is unique about the Bible, and one thing that's unique about the New Testament and the Old Testament, the Torah, is how unflinchingly honest it is at times about how people thought about God, and whether they got it right or they got it wrong. I don't believe it tries to whitewash. There's a lot of times when if the Israelites were trying to paint themselves as heroes of the stories, they did a bad job.
Yeah,
like they showed themselves to be the asshats that they were, and then I think is that's the treasure of Scripture. It's the same thing that Rene Girard notices in Scripture, which leads him to start studying Scripture more. Is that that story is not always told from the point of view of the victor. A lot of times it's told from the point of view of the victim, which is a very unique thing in literature, which caused someone like Rene Girard to rethink what he thought about Scripture. So it's a much more interesting question when we consider it to be a human product, whether or not you still cling to a divinely inspired product is another question, but inerrant, perfect, infallible, yikes.
Written by God.
Dictated by people possessed by the Holy Spirit on heavenly typewriters. I don't know about that. If that's the case, they did a bad job.
They did a very bad job.
Lots of contradictions in there.
God got confused at some point.
Anyway.
All right, this is Not Church podcast.
Yes, sir.
Good hanging out with you guys.
Man, I appreciate it. Thank you, Paul. Enjoyed it.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
And thanks to all the gang hanging out with us live as we record this, and it'll be coming out as a podcast and a YouTube video soon. So we'll let you
Very
get
cool.
to that. Let me
Appreciate
jump us
you, man.
off in